The sun was a white-hot eye staring down at the construction site of the Meridian Towers in Victoria Island, a relentless observer of Samuel's exhaustion. He wiped the sweat from his brow with a forearm coated in fine cement dust, the grit stinging his skin like 1,000 tiny needles. His hands, once meant for holding drafting pens and navigating complex architectural software, were now rough, calloused, and permanently stained with the grey residue of mortar. Samuel was a man built of broken dreams and iron will. 3 years ago, he had been the top of his class at the University of Lagos, a brilliant student of structural engineering with a scholarship that promised a way out of the mainland slums. He remembered the smell of old library books in Akoka and the hum of late-night computers, a world that felt like a past life. Then came the phone call that changed everything. His father's sudden heart failure on a dusty road in his home village in the east. The grief was followed by a more practical terror. His mother, Mama Ruth, collapsed under the weight of the loss, her own heart beginning to fail. The scholarship didn't cover heart medication, and it certainly didn't pay for his younger sister Sarah's school fees at the public secondary school. Samuel had made the only choice he could. He traded his graduation gown for a yellow safety vest, returning to the city not as a designer of skylines, but as a laborer forgotten in the shadows of the skyscrapers. Every brick he laid was a silent prayer. This one is for Mama's pills. This one is for Sarah's new uniform. He worked double shifts, often skipping lunch to save a few extra naira. While other workers sat in the shade, eating meat pies and drinking cold minerals, Samuel would find a quiet corner, drinking water to trick his stomach into feeling full. His only luxury was a crumpled photo of his father kept in his pocket, a reminder of the man who had taught him that a man's character is his only true wealth. During the lunch break, a sleek silver car pulled up to the site office, its polished surface reflecting the grime of the workers like a mirror from another world. Isabella Vance stepped out. Even from a distance, Samuel could see the rigidity in her posture. She wore a tailored charcoal suit that looked like armor against the Lagos humidity. Behind her dark sunglasses, she seemed to be looking at the towers not with pride, but with a weary, suffocating sense of duty. "Eyes on your own business, Sam," a co-worker grunted. "That's Isabella Vance. Her father owns half of Lekki. People like us just build the walls. We don't get to look over them." Samuel watched her for a moment longer than he should have. He didn't see a billionaire. He saw a woman who looked just as trapped by her world as he was by his. He went back to his mortar, the weight of the sun feeling just a little heavier. The workday ended at 6, but the fatigue didn't leave Samuel's body. It simply settled into his bones like lead. While the foreman drove away in air-conditioned SUVs, their tires kicking up dust that coated Samuel's lungs, he began his long trek home. He needed to get from Victoria Island back to the crowded streets of Ajagunle, a journey he made largely on foot to save the bus fare. Over a month, those saved nairas meant Sarah wouldn't have to share a textbook with 3 other students. His boots were worn thin, the leather cracked, and the soles so eroded that he could feel every pebble and every surge of heat from the Lagos asphalt. He walked past the glittering storefronts of the Palms Mall, where the air-conditioning units hummed and dripped water onto the sidewalk. He saw his dusty reflection in the windows of luxury boutiques, a ghost of a man standing next to mannequins draped in silk. He was 25, but the reflection showed a man whose youth had been sanded away by 10-hour shifts and the relentless sun. The hunger was a dull, constant ache in his lower back. He passed a street vendor roasting corn and uber, the smell so sweet and smoky it made his mouth water painfully. He looked away, focusing on the rhythmic slap hiss of his worn boots. He reached the Third Mainland Bridge bypass, where the traffic moved in a frantic, uncaring stream of yellow Danfoss and silver Mercedes. Suddenly, the evening air was shattered. A high-pitched scream of tires losing their grip on reality was followed by a sound so violent it made the birds in the nearby trees scatter in a panic. It was the sickening metallic crunch of a high-speed impact, a sound like a giant foot stepping on a soda can. A black SUV, clipped by a reckless truck that didn't even tap its brakes as it fled the scene, spun wildly and slammed headfirst into a concrete pylon near the lagoon edge. Samuel dropped his bag, containing nothing but a water bottle and a tattered engineering textbook, and ran. As he approached, the scene was surreal. A crowd was already forming, but it was a circle of silence and blue light. Dozens of people stood in a semicircle, their phones held high. They weren't calling for help, they were recording for their social media feeds. The orange glow of the engine fire reflected in their camera lenses, turning their eyes into flickering embers of voyeurism. "It's going to blow. Look at the fuel leaking," someone yelled, stepping backward to get a wider shot for their status. Samuel didn't hear them. He didn't see the crowd. Through the spider-webbed glass of the driver's side window, he saw a shock of dark hair and a hand, the fingers trembling, reaching for a door handle that was no longer there. A human being was trapped in a cage of fire, and the world was watching for the likes. The heat hit Samuel like a physical blow when he breached the invisible line the crowd had established. The air was a thick, poisonous soup of melting plastic, spilled gasoline, and the metallic copper scent of blood. The front of the SUV was a mangled mess, the hood crumpled like paper, and the engine block already beginning to roar with a malevolent, white-hot light. "Get back, you fool! You'll die for nothing!" a bystander shouted. Samuel ignored the voice. He reached the car, the soles of his boots beginning to smoke. Inside, Isabella Vance was slumped against the deflating airbag. Her face was pale, streaked with soot and a thin ribbon of blood. Her legs were pinned by the dashboard, which had been shoved inward by the force of the pylon. A small, hungry fire had already started in the footwell, the carpet beginning to smolder around her ankles. Samuel grabbed a heavy, jagged stone from the roadside. He smashed the side window, the glass shattering in a diamond spray that sliced his knuckles. He didn't feel the pain. "Isabella, look at me," he roared, his voice competing with the hiss of the radiator and the distant roar of the Lagos traffic. She groaned, her eyes fluttering open. For a heartbeat, the billionaire heiress and the bricklayer looked at each other through the smoke. The fear in her eyes was raw, stripped of all status and wealth, the primal terror of a soul realizing it might die in a metal box while strangers filmed the spectacle. "The door won't open," she gasped, her voice thick with soot. Samuel didn't hesitate. He reached into the furnace. The metal frame of the door was hot enough to sear skin, but he ignored the sting. He used his work knife, the one he used to cut mortar bags too. Saw through the jammed seatbelt. The heat was so intense, the air seemed to shimmer, blurring his vision. He braced his feet against the car's frame and wrenched the crushed dashboard upward with a roar of pure, desperate strength. His muscles screamed, his back felt like it was breaking, but he felt the metal give. He hauled her out through the window just as a wall of fire surged through the vents, turning the interior into a kiln. He carried her in his arms, his yellow vest shielding her as he sprinted away. He hadn't gone 15 yards when the fuel tank ignited. The shockwave of the explosion threw him forward. He twisted in mid-air, taking the brunt of the fall on his own scorched back and shoulders to ensure she didn't hit the pavement. The hospital waiting room at the Lagoon Hospital was a place of sterile cruelty. White lights, the smell of bleach, and the low, urgent murmurs of doctors. Samuel sat on a hard plastic chair in the corner. He looked like a nightmare. His clothes were blackened, his skin was red and blistered, and he was covered in the fine white dust of the construction site mixed with the soot of the car. The nurses moved around him with a mix of confusion and suspicion. In this private, high-end facility, Samuel was a loud, dusty anomaly. He looked like a man who should be in the morgue, yet he was the only one who had arrived with the patient. "Sir, we need the intake deposit for the emergency diagnostics," a nurse said, her voice dropping as she saw his burned hands. "The corporate insurance hasn't been verified yet, and her family isn't answering the emergency line." Samuel didn't blink. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the envelope of cash he had intended to send home to his mother. It was 15,000 naira, the result of a month of back-breaking labor and skipped meals. It was Sarah's school fees. It was the heart pills his mother needed to breathe without pain. He looked at the money. He thought of his mother's tired smile in Ahigunle. Then he looked at the closed doors of the emergency room where Isabella was fighting for her breath. He handed the envelope to the nurse. "Take it," he said, his voice a raspy whisper. "Just help her." He stayed through the night, drifting in and out of a shallow, pain-filled sleep. He didn't want to leave until he knew the fire hadn't taken her. Around dawn, the silence was broken by the arrival of a convoy of black SUVs. Elias Vance, a man who looked like he was made of granite and expensive wool, marched in with a phalanx of security. They pushed past Samuel as if he were part of the furniture, a piece of trash to be swept away from the inner sanctum of power. When the doctor finally announced she was stable, Samuel stood up, his joints popping like dry twigs. He didn't wait for a thank you from the men in suits. He walked out into the cool morning air of Marina, his pockets empty and his arms burning with the fire he had stolen her from. He began the long walk back to his room, wondering how he would explain the empty envelope to the woman who gave him life. For the next 3 days, Samuel lived in a state of suspended animation in his small room in Aigunle. He couldn't go back to the site. His hands were too blistered to hold a trowel, and his back was a map of bruises. He sat in his small room, listening to the rain drip through the hole in the ceiling and onto a plastic bucket. Drip, drip, drip. It sounded like a clock ticking down the end of his life. The hunger was no longer a dull ache. It was a sharp, biting animal in his stomach. But the worst part was the phone call. "Samuel, is that you?" Mama Ruth's voice was weak, punctuated by the sounds of the neighborhood children playing outside. "Did the foreman pay? The chemist says the medicine is waiting." Samuel closed his eyes, a single tear cutting a track through the soot on his cheek. It's delayed, Mama. The company had an issue. Another few days." "I'm sorry." The disappointment in her voice, the quiet, resigned, "Oh, I see," broke him more than the fire ever could. He felt the crushing weight of his choice. He had saved a billionaire, and for his reward, his mother would go without medicine for a week. He felt a flicker of bitterness toward the world, toward the people who watched the fire with their phones, and toward the men in suits who had pushed him aside. On the third day, a knock came at his door. It was a sharp, rhythmic sound that didn't belong in a tenement building. A man in a dark suit stood in the hallway, looking around the trash-strewn corridor with visible disgust. "Samuel? My name is Marcus. I'm the head of security for the Vance Group. Miss Isabella has regained consciousness. She is asking for the man who paid her deposit. There is a car waiting." Samuel looked at his bandaged hands. He put on his only clean shirt, a frayed white button-down he saved for church, and followed the man. As the sleek black car drove away from the slums and toward the bridge to the islands, Samuel felt like he was being pulled between two different planets. The Vance Group headquarters in Marina was a palace of glass that seemed to pierce the very clouds. Samuel felt like an intruder as he walked across the marble lobby, his worn work boots leaving faint dusty prints on the polished floor. He was ushered into a massive office on the top floor where the entire city of Lagos looked like a miniature model. Isabella was there, her head bandaged, sitting in a wheelchair by the window. She looked fragile, stripped of the armor she had worn at the site. Beside her stood Elias Vance. "Sit down, Samuel," Isabella said. Her voice was shaky but warm. "I am Elias Vance," the man said, his eyes scanning Samuel with a terrifying intensity. "You saved my daughter. You walked into a fire that my own security detail admitted they would have hesitated to enter. And then you paid for her care with money that, based on your records, you needed for your family's survival. Why?" Samuel looked him in the eye, refusing to be intimidated by the glass and the gold. "Because she's a person, Mr. Vance, and no person should be left to die while others are watching through a screen. Money can be replaced. A life cannot." Elias was silent for a long time. Then he pushed a thick leather folder across the desk. "I've looked into you, Samuel. You were the top of your class at Unilag. You're a structural engineer living in a room that isn't fit for a human being. I don't believe in handouts, but I do believe in foundations. We are launching a project for low-income housing in the sector you live in," Isabella added, her eyes fixed on his. "I want you to be the lead consultant. We will pay for the completion of your master's degree and provide you with a salary that reflects your worth. Not as a reward for the fire, but because we need someone who understands that buildings are for people, not just for profit." Samuel looked at the folder. For the first time in 3 years, the weight on his shoulders didn't feel like lead. It felt like the beginning of a bridge. The transformation of Samuel's life was rapid, but his heart remained grounded in the dust of the Sight. He moved his mother and Sarah to a home in Surulere with a garden where the air didn't smell like exhaust. He finished his degree, graduating with honors that felt like a vindication of every brick he had ever laid. But the most unexpected change was Isabella. She began visiting the new housing sites, not as a distant owner in a silver car, but as a partner. They spent late nights over blueprints and cold coffee. She told him about the suffocating pressure of being an heiress, of never knowing if people liked her or her bank account. He told her about the rhythm of the village and the strength it took to keep a plumb line straight when your stomach was empty. "You're the only person who doesn't look at me and see a dollar sign," she said one evening as they stood on the balcony of a half-finished building in Yaba, the city lights twinkling below them. "And you're the only person who looked at the man in the yellow vest and saw a human being worth talking to," Samuel replied. The class difference didn't disappear. The Lagos tabloids were cruel, calling him a social climber, and Elias Vance was often skeptical. But their bond was forged in the same fire that had nearly killed them. It was a slow, steady build, brick by brick, until it was the strongest thing in their lives. They found that while they came from different worlds, they both knew what it felt like to be trapped in a cage. Together, they were the key. A year later, the first phase of the Meridian Housing Project in Ajagunle was opened. It wasn't a glass skyscraper for the rich, it was a sturdy, beautiful complex with wide windows and communal spaces for the people who actually built the city. At the ceremony, Samuel stood at the podium. He wasn't wearing a yellow vest, but a well-fitted suit. He looked out at the crowd, his mother in the front row, crying tears of joy as she breathed easily, his sister Sarah, now a top student in a school that had a library, and the workers in their yellow vests who stood a little taller, seeing one of their own leading the project. "A building is only as strong as the integrity of the people who build it," Samuel said, his voice echoing across the courtyard. "We aren't just providing shelter today, we are providing dignity. We are proving that the foundation of this city isn't concrete. It's the people who refuse to look away when someone is in need." He looked at Isabella, who was standing by his side. She wasn't wearing her dark sunglasses anymore. She was looking at the crowd, her face open and bright, her hand resting naturally in his. The wedding was held months later on the very spot where they had first met, the construction site in Victoria Island. It was a celebration of two worlds merging. Samuel's old co-workers shared tables with CEOs, and the sound of juju music mingled with a classical orchestra. As the sun set over the lagoon, casting a golden glow over the city they were rebuilding together, Samuel took Isabella's hand. He thought about the 4-mile walk, the scorched yellow vest, and the 15,000 naira. He realized that his suffering hadn't been a waste, it had been the mortar that held his character together. He had run toward the fire, and in doing so, he had built a life that no flame could ever destroy. The first year of marriage was a masterclass in diplomacy. Samuel was no longer laying bricks, but he often felt he was building walls out of whispers. In the boardroom in Marina, the executives looked at him like a well-dressed intruder. To them, he was a lucky laborer who had traded a rock for a ring. "The numbers for the third phase are too high, Samuel," Julian, the CFO, said during a rainy Tuesday meeting. He tapped a diamond ring against the mahogany table. "We're building social housing, not a boutique hotel in Echo Atlantic. We can cut costs on the ventilation systems." Samuel leaned forward. He didn't look at the spreadsheets. He looked at Julian. "If you cut the ventilation, the mold will settle into the lungs of every child in that building within 3 years. If you cut the gardens, you take away the only place where the community gathers to breathe. We aren't just building structures, we are building health." Elias Vance, sitting at the head of the table, watched the exchange with an unreadable expression. Samuel felt the weight of the suit on his shoulders. It was heavier than any bag of cement. He was fighting for people who weren't in the room, using a language he was still perfecting. That night, Isabella found him in their study, staring at a scale model of the next phase. "You're thinking about the site again," she said softly, rubbing his shoulders. "I'm thinking about the men I used to work with," Samuel admitted. "They see me on the news, and I wonder if they think I've forgotten. And then I come here, and I wonder if these people will ever let me belong." "You don't need to belong to them, Sam," Isabella whispered. "You just need to lead them." Success brought scrutiny. A tabloid ran a deep dive into Samuel's past, twisting his struggle into a narrative of manipulation. They claimed he had positioned himself near the crash on purpose, that his Unilag records were forged by the Vance group. Samuel wanted to ignore it, but the whispers reached Sarah's school and Mama Ruth's neighbors in Surulere. The piece he had bought for his family was beginning to fray at the edges. "Is it true, brother?" Sarah asked over the dinner one Sunday. She was 13 now, sharp and observant. "They say you knew who she was before the fire." Samuel felt a sharp pain in his chest, old burns itching beneath his shirt. "Sarah, I was walking home to save 60 naira. I didn't know the owner of the world from a shadow in a silver car. I saved her because she was dying." Isabella took legal action, but the damage to Samuel's confidence was done. He felt like he was back on that long walk, every eye on the street judging his dusty boots. Then a massive tropical storm hit Lagos. While the wealthy areas had generators and drainage, the older tenements were in danger. A call came in the middle of the night. The old pylon near the bypass, weakened by the fire a year ago and never properly repaired by the city, was threatening to collapse onto a row of houses. Samuel didn't call the city engineers. He knew they would take hours to mobilize through the flooded streets. He grabbed his old work boots and his heavy-duty flashlight. "I'm coming with you," Isabella said, her eyes fierce. They arrived at the scene to find chaos. The wind was a howling beast, and the pylon was leaning at a terrifying angle. People were screaming, trying to move their belongings in the dark. Samuel didn't see a consultant in the mirror that night. He saw the engineer. He saw the man who knew the physics of the earth. He began shouting orders, organizing the local men to create temporary shoring with timber and sandbags. He was back in the mud, his expensive clothes ruined, his hands gripping the rough wood. Isabella was there too, directing the distribution of emergency supplies. From the back of their SUV, for the first time the people of the slums saw the billionaire Heiress not as a figure on a billboard, but as a woman with mud on her face, helping a grandmother into a raincoat. By dawn the pylon was stabilized, the houses were safe. The neighborhood men stood around Samuel, their breathing heavy in the morning mist. One of them, an old man who had lived there for 40 years, stepped forward. "We saw what the papers said, Samuel," the man rasped. "But a man doesn't stand in a storm like this for a lie. You're one of us." The storm changed the narrative. The photos that went viral weren't of Samuel in a tuxedo, but of Samuel and Isabella covered in grit, working alongside the community. The social climber label died in the mud of the slums. Isabella Vance called Samuel into his office a week later. For the first time, he poured Samuel a drink. "I was wrong about the gardens, Samuel," Elias said, looking out at the Lagos skyline. "The gardens aren't just for breathing, they're for loyalty. The people of this city will protect our buildings because they feel the buildings belong to them." Samuel looked at his hands. They were scarred, but they were steady. "I've realized something, Elias. I don't want to be a consultant anymore. I want to start a Vance Foundation dedicated solely to infrastructure in the underserved districts. I want to build the things that aren't profitable, but are necessary." Isabella walked in, hearing the end of the conversation. She looked at Samuel with a love that had evolved from gratitude into a profound shared mission. "We'll do it together," she said. The story of the bricklayer and the heiress didn't end with a wedding. It continued through every school they built, every clean water pipe they laid, and every bridge they constructed. They proved that the most important structures aren't the ones that reach for the sky, but the ones that hold up the earth for the people standing on it. Samuel still kept the crumpled photo of his father in his pocket. Sometimes, when he was standing on a high balcony looking at the city, he would take it out. He had finally built the world he had once only been able to imagine through the dust of a construction site. He was no longer a ghost in a yellow vest. He was the man who had taught the city how to build with heart. As the Vance Foundation took root, Samuel found himself traveling back to the very village he had fled in a state of desperation years ago. The dusty roads remained, but the spirit of the place felt different now that he was returning with the means to change it. He stood before the modest grave of his father, the silence of the countryside a stark contrast to the roar of the Lagos construction sites. "I'm doing it, Papa," he whispered, the wind carrying his voice across the fields. "I'm building the bridges you told me about." But the village had long memories. Some of the elders looked at him with suspicion, wondering if his wealth had come at the cost of his soul. They saw the expensive car and the tailored clothes, but they didn't see the blisters beneath the silk. Samuel spent weeks walking the village, listening to the needs of the people, refusing to be treated like a visiting deity. He ate the local food, sat on the ground with the farmers, and slowly the wall of suspicion began to crumble. Back in the city, Isabella was facing her own battles. The board of directors was attempting a quiet coup, using Samuel's distraction with the foundation as evidence that the Vance family was losing focus on profitability. Isabella, once the girl who hid behind dark sunglasses, stood her ground in the boardroom. She used the data Samuel had gathered, showing that social stability increased long-term property values, to outmaneuver the grey-haired men who saw only the next quarter's dividends. Samuel realized that to truly change the city, he couldn't just use existing methods, he had to innovate. He began working on a new type of modular housing that utilized recycled materials from construction waste, the very rubble he used to haul away by hand. He spent nights in the lab, his engineering degree finally being pushed to its limits. The breakthrough came when he figured out a way to stabilize the local clay into high-strength bricks without the need for high-heat kilns, drastically reducing costs and carbon footprint. He called it legacy stone. When the first legacy stone building was erected in the heart of a former slum, it became a symbol of a new era. It wasn't just a house, it was an enduring record of the fact that the earth beneath the poor was valuable. The project drew international attention, and suddenly the Bricklayer was being invited to speak at global summits. Through it all, Samuel and Isabella maintained a ritual. Every Friday evening, no matter where they were in the world, they would walk through one of their completed projects. They wouldn't announce their arrival. They would simply walk, holding hands, listening to the sounds of families cooking dinner, children playing in the gardens, and the quiet hum of a community that had found its footing. 10 years after the fire, Samuel stood at the top of the completed Meridian Towers, the very site where he had once stood in a yellow vest, praying for his mother's medicine. The view was breathtaking, a tapestry of a city that was slowly healing its divisions. Mama Ruth was there, sitting in a comfortable chair, her heart strong enough to see her grandson take his first steps on the marble floor. Sarah was a senior at the university, studying architecture, her sketches already showing a brilliance that surpassed even Samuel's. Isabella stood beside him, her hand in his. They didn't need words. They looked down at the bypass, where a small memorial had been placed at the site of the crash. It wasn't a marker of a tragedy, but a tribute to a moment of choice. "Do you ever miss it?" Isabella asked, looking at his hands, which still bore the faint silvery lines of the burns. "The site?" Samuel smiled, thinking of the weight of the sun. "I miss the clarity of it, knowing exactly what needed to be built. But I don't miss the hunger, and I don't miss the feeling that the world was built for someone else." He pulled a small, worn object from his pocket, a single polished brick from the very first wall he had laid at the Meridian site. He had kept it all these years as a reminder. "The world is built by whoever is willing to pick up the tools," he said. As the sun set over the city, casting long shadows of progress across the land, the Bricklayer and the Heiress turned away from the view to join their family. They had built more than towers and foundations. They had built an enduring legacy of empathy, proving that in the end, the most vital structures are the ones we build for each other.